May 1940. Northern France. At dawn, the front still exists. By nightfall, it is already cracking. Within 48 hours, an entire defensive system collapses under pressure it was never prepared to face. This is the story of an invasion that did not fail slowly. It failed all at once. In 1940, France believed it understood war. The memory of the First World War still shaped every plan, every doctrine, every expectation. Defensive strength mattered more than speed. Holding ground mattered more than movement. The nation had invested years into fortifications, rigid command structures, and carefully layered lines meant to stop an enemy advance before it could gain momentum. The French army was large. It was experienced. It was confident in its preparations. The Maginot Line symbolized that confidence. Concrete, steel, and artillery embedded into the earth. It represented stability. It represented certainty. But it also represented a way of thinking rooted in the past. By early May, intelligence reports warned of German movement. Columns of armor. Motorized infantry. Aircraft repositioned near the western borders. Yet the expectation remained unchanged. The main assault, it was believed, would come through familiar corridors. Belgium. Open plains. Predictable routes. Commanders prepared to respond as they always had. Orders moved slowly. Decisions traveled upward through layers of authority. Flexibility was limited. Initiative was discouraged. Units were trained to hold positions, not to improvise under sudden shock. In northern France, along the Meuse River and the Ardennes region, defenses were thin. The terrain was considered unsuitable for large armored formations. Forested. Narrow roads. Poor visibility. French planners believed this area could not support a rapid mechanized advance. As a result, second-line units held these positions. Older reservists. Limited anti-tank weapons. Sparse air support. On paper, the invasion had not yet begun. In reality, the conditions for collapse were already in place. When German forces moved, they did not wait for perfection. They moved fast. They accepted risk. They concentrated armor and air power at specific points rather than spreading it evenly. Their doctrine emphasized disruption, confusion, speed. French communication systems struggled under pressure. Telephone lines were vulnerable. Radio use was restricted. Messages arrived late or not at all. Local commanders often lacked permission to act independently, even when facing immediate danger. The first clashes felt manageable. Artillery exchanged fire. Reconnaissance units withdrew. Reports described enemy probes, not a breakthrough. Headquarters interpreted events through existing assumptions. The situation seemed serious, but not decisive. Then bridges were seized. Air attacks intensified. Columns of armor appeared where they were not expected. By the end of the first day, cracks widened across the front. By the beginning of the second, those cracks connected. The invasion had found its opening. And the collapse was already accelerating. The second day began with uncertainty. Reports from the front contradicted one another. Some units claimed they were holding. Others reported retreat. A few simply went silent. Headquarters struggled to assemble a clear picture. Maps were outdated almost as soon as they were marked. German armored units advanced relentlessly. They did not wait for flanks to be secured. They did not pause to consolidate. Their objective was depth, not territory. Penetration, not occupation. Behind them, infantry followed. Ahead of them, chaos spread. French units encountered a form of warfare they had not trained for. Dive bombers struck command posts. Roads filled with refugees. Supply columns jammed narrow routes. Orders arrived too late to matter. Counterattacks were planned on paper but collapsed before they could begin. Air superiority shifted decisively. French aircraft flew bravely but in smaller numbers. Coordination between ground and air units was limited. German planes operated with freedom. They disrupted movement. They shattered morale. They turned retreats into routes. Commanders faced impossible choices. Hold positions and risk encirclement. Withdraw and risk disintegration. Some chose to fight. Isolated units resisted fiercely. Anti-tank guns destroyed advancing vehicles at close range. Infantry held villages street by street. But these efforts were disconnected. Local success could not stop systemic failure. The speed of the advance created psychological shock. Soldiers trained for static defense now faced enemies appearing behind them. Rumors spread faster than orders. Whispers of encirclement. Stories of units cut off and destroyed. Fear multiplied in the absence of reliable information. By the afternoon of the second day, entire sectors ceased to function. Divisions lost cohesion. Regiments fragmented. Command posts abandoned their positions under air attack. Staff officers burned documents and fled. Attempts to restore control failed. Reserves could not be deployed in time. Roads were blocked. Fuel ran out. Units moved without direction. The structure of command, once rigid and reassuring, became a liability. There was no mechanism for rapid adaptation. The invasion no longer resembled a battle. It resembled collapse in motion. By nightfall, German forces had crossed critical points. The defensive line no longer existed as a line. It existed only as isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by empty space. 48 hours had not yet passed. But the outcome was already irreversible. The third phase unfolded without ceremony. No dramatic announcement. No single decisive order. The collapse simply completed itself. French headquarters finally understood the scale of the disaster. The enemy was not breaking through. He was already behind. Communications confirmed what fear had already suggested. Entire armies were at risk of encirclement. Desperate measures followed. Orders for counteroffensives were issued, then cancelled. New defensive lines were drawn, then abandoned. Commanders moved from one temporary headquarters to another, chased by advancing armor and constant air attack. On the ground, soldiers experienced the climax differently. Some fought until ammunition ran out. Some surrendered when surrounded. Others walked away, exhausted, disoriented, no longer part of any organized force. The roads filled with men moving west. Without units. Without objectives. Without clarity. Weapons were discarded to move faster. Vehicles were abandoned when fuel ran dry. The symbols of a modern army dissolved into scattered individuals. German columns continued forward. Bridges intact. Crossroads secured. Resistance weakened not by destruction alone, but by paralysis. The system opposing them could no longer think as a whole. Within 48 hours, the defensive doctrine that had defined French military planning for decades was rendered obsolete. Not defeated piece by piece. Bypassed. Overwhelmed. Exposed. Losses mounted. Not only in lives, but in capability. Artillery captured. Vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Entire formations removed from the order of battle without a final engagement. The invasion's success was not based solely on numbers. It was based on tempo. The ability to act faster than the enemy could understand. To force decisions before options existed. To collapse resistance through speed rather than annihilation. By the end of the second full day, the front no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The invasion had achieved strategic breakthrough. The consequences would unfold over weeks. But the decisive failure occurred in hours. This was the moment. The moment the war in France changed direction. The moment recovery became impossible. And yet, no monument marks it. The collapse did not end with a decisive moment. It ended with absence. When the fighting moved forward, it left behind spaces that no longer had meaning. Defensive positions stood empty. Command posts were abandoned in haste. Maps remained pinned to walls, showing fronts that no longer existed. The war continued elsewhere, but here, something had already passed and would not return. Units that once held names and numbers dissolved quietly. Some were captured. Others retreated without structure. Many simply disappeared into the mass of prisoners, refugees, and displaced soldiers moving westward. Records struggled to keep pace. Reports listed formations that could no longer be located. Strength figures lost relevance. What remained was uncertainty. The land itself absorbed the collapse. Fields showed the marks of vehicles that never came back. Roads were littered with equipment left behind to move faster. Villages that had briefly become strongpoints returned to silence. No flags were raised. No announcements followed. The invasion did not pause to acknowledge what it had broken. In later days, attention shifted elsewhere. New battles demanded explanation. Larger defeats overshadowed earlier ones. The speed of the collapse made it difficult to isolate in memory. There was no single date that defined it. No final stand that could be easily described. Only a rapid disappearance of structure and control. For the men who were there, the moment became fragmented. Some remembered hours of noise and fear. Others remembered long periods of waiting and confusion. Many remembered nothing clearly at all. Time blurred. Events overlapped. The collapse resisted simple retelling. As the war expanded, this failure became absorbed into a broader narrative. It lost its edges. It lost its names. What had fallen in 48 hours became a footnote measured in hindsight rather than experience. The invasion moved on. The front never returned. And in the places where it ended, only silence remained. These stories are rarely told. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one.